Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for an MP webinar covering the 2022 Interviewing Best Practices and Compliance Guidelines. I'm Katie Kreider, Marketing Specialist here at MP. For those of you joining us on a webinar for the first time, MP is a full-service human capital management company. We offer a complete suite of products and services to support organizations through the entire employee lifecycle, including recruiting, HR, payroll, benefits administration, time and attendance, and compliance assistance. We support our clients with cutting-edge technical solutions, as well as proactive, reliable service and deep HR and payroll expertise. At MP, we are wired for HR and help our clients succeed by aligning their people strategy with their business goals. I'm excited to introduce your presenter for today's program, Sarah. Sarah is a SHRM certified HR partner at MP, providing HR support to businesses of all sizes in a variety of industries. She assists business owners and managers at all levels of the organization in developing and implementing optimal HR infrastructure. Sarah has her bachelor's degree in psychology and business administration from the University of Texas at Austin and continued her studies in human resource management at Chaplin College in her home state of Vermont. She has experience across HR, specializing in talent acquisition, engagement, and wellness. A quick legal disclaimer: this training is intended for educational and informational purposes. While we hope that you will learn a lot today, we are not attorneys and the information should not be construed as legal advice. Just a few housekeeping issues before we get started here today. If you would like to submit a question during the program, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. We will be sending out the recording of the webinar later today along with the slides. And with that, I'm going to hand the mic off to Sarah.
Thank you, Katie, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks again for joining us today. We're going to start by reviewing the presentation topics. As you can see, we have a lot to cover. So that's going to include planning, preparing, and conducting interviews. We're going to touch on virtual interviews, behavioral interviewing techniques, the STAR approach, some all-around best practices, and we'll finish up by reviewing compliance and discrimination considerations. So in 2022, innovative talent recruitment strategies are crucial. While a bad hire is always a costly thing, it's even more damaging now with the job market the way it is. You know, it's challenging to navigate. Candidates are commanding higher salaries, sometimes significantly higher than pre-pandemic. And together, all of these concerns are driving costs for employers right now. So we're here today to review why employers need some optimized interviewing and selection strategies to attract and land talent in this candidates market. Right. So basically, the benefits of an effective interviewing and selection process are going to include reduced employee turnover and related costs, increased productivity and employee morale, and ensuring a consistent process to avoid any legal claims. So first, we're going to talk about what the steps are needed to plan and prepare conducting interviews. One of the most challenging components of the hiring process for a candidate can be the uncertainty of it, right? So they may feel nervous or uncomfortable when they don't know, for example, how long the process will take or what next steps are. Employers can make candidates more at ease when they offer one clear, efficient interviewing process. So when a candidate is at any stage of the hiring process, their interviewer or HR contact should be prepared to share both what steps will be taken next and a timeline of upcoming events. So if interviewers or HR staff provide conflicting information, this is where the candidate could view the conflict as a sign of a disorganized or chaotic workplace. Candidates may drop out if they have to perform too many interviews or wait too long for decisions. And so this scenario is especially prevalent now when candidates are in high demand and often fielding multiple simultaneous job offers. So getting into the job description, back one, there we go. The job descriptions. Basically, this is where the planning starts, which we are going to create the job description, which can be used to build out the job posting, determine selection criteria, and then develop interview questions. So a clear and complete job description is really the first step to finding the right candidate for your open position. You're going to want to clearly define the functions and responsibilities of the role, and it's ultimately going to help you determine what questions are important to ask candidates and gauge the applicant's abilities and previous experience performing the essential functions of the role. So simply put, essential job function is basically a function that the person holding the job must be able to perform with or without reasonable accommodation, whereas a non-essential job function are those that do not affect the essence of the job and could be assigned to other employees or taken on by other departments, things like that. So when we define the essential functions, it's also going to help us get the right applicants for the role, which ends up freeing up more of your time. So you aren't reviewing applicants who are, maybe not qualified for the position or just not interested in the day-to-day responsibilities. It's also important to define what the role's non-essential functions are, so that when you're interviewing applicants for the role, you're not only focusing on the important skills of the position, but also any of the background qualifications as well. And as I'm sure you've all experienced at this point, it's crucial to consider any changes to the role due to COVID and a more fully or a hybrid or fully remote work environment. For example, if a position normally has the essential function of meeting in person with prospective clients, the job description and job posting should be changed to say these meetings are now conducted virtually. Next, we're going to establish the criteria you want to create to select the perfect candidate. So a clear criteria will serve as an initial screen of applicants and help you narrow your recruiting funnel. So your criteria should be developed with the position's title, essential functions, and place in the organization in mind. For example, if you're searching for a director of sales who would be meeting with, say, major hospital executives, as well as managing a team of sales reps, the criteria you should create reflect the amount of years of experience in sales that you believe is necessary to successfully do the job, as well as what education and training you feel is necessary to properly function at a director level. Maybe you feel the sales director must have an MBA, or that all director level positions must have a master's degree. You would want to add this to your selection criteria. Especially now in the ongoing pandemic, adding language about the candidate's previous experience and ability to work in a remote environment will help you screen applicants and really weed out anyone who may not be able or comfortable working remotely. And if departmental and organizational needs are also important as a function of the role, you might also want to add some criteria language about achieving or surpassing goals in a previous role. So for our next slide, reviewing applications and resumes. When it comes to reviewing applications and resumes, you first want to consider who's going to be responsible for doing this, right? So if you have a designated recruiter or a hiring team, then this is the easy part. However, I know that a lot of my clients are small businesses, and it's really on management that, they're really responsible for hiring from start to finish. And they can oftentimes be wearing many hats at once. So it's kind of important to establish who's going to be doing what, and really set aside some time. So for example, you may want to have a calendar alert every 3 days to budget out some time for any applicants that have come in and you have not yet had a chance to review. Some weeks can just fly by and then we realize we haven't had a chance to look at any of our candidates yet. And unfortunately, with everything being as fast moving as it is today, we need to move really quickly on strong candidates. And it's just key because the best candidates are off the market in 10 days. And that's according to a job openings and turnover survey that's conducted by the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. So as we previously mentioned, once you have your criteria made, you are able to then apply it when you're reviewing applications. So using the criteria, you can cross-reference what you're looking for and if the applicant has a required or relatable experience and training that you're looking for. Things you might want to consider on the application are any gaps in their employment, how long they've been at each position, any special skills, projects, or achievements that they've accomplished in the past. And one of the keys to interviewing is that past behavior really predicts future behavior. And we're going to dive into this a bit more when we review behavioral interviewing techniques. And lastly, it's always a good idea to take some notes on a separate piece of paper, or ideally an interview template worksheet, rather than writing all over the resume. This will kind of keep you a little more organized, especially when you're comparing candidates. And then you'll have a clean copy of the applicant's resume that you might want to bring to a potential interview or keep on file for records retention. So moving on to development of job-related questions. When we talk about developing questions, well, you want to use the job description to create relevant questions ahead of time. So creating a templated list of questions, this can really ensure that we have created an efficient and equitable practice or hiring practice, which is what we're all striving for today. So namely, we want to ensure that we're asking the same questions of all candidates to ensure that we have some really objective data to review when it comes time to select the right person for the job. Furthermore, it can keep you or your management team on track and avoid getting into some of those sticky situations with personal questions or what may be considered kind of harmless get to know you questions that can really have some real and perceived effects when it comes to hiring discrimination. What you want to be aware of in general in interviewing is if you're steering away from any job specific questions, you want to rein it back in and get back to the job itself. It can be super easy to kind of get off track, especially if the interview is going well, or if the candidate's super personable or well-spoken. We'll talk a little bit more about why it's so important, though, that we kind of stick to our designated list of questions and keep it consistent when we get to the compliance and discrimination section. So the questions you craft should be directed towards the specific job requirements you created for the role. And once you've been able to determine what the essential functions are, you should create at least one question per function and potentially more depending on the function importance in the job itself. And these questions should be specific to past experience. We want to kind of stay away from opinion-based or what would you do hypothetical type of questions. Again, using the example of the sales position, you may want to ask questions relating to their past experience creating client relationships or managing sales pipelines, closing deals, and so on and so forth. Next, talking about pre-screening applicants. In the first round of screening, it can be really easy to do by phone, Zoom, or any kind of video interviewing platform, and that's really across industries. It will help you determine who to meet with for a more formal interview, whether that be in person or, if the whole thing is going to be virtual and they're going to be working remote. You should already be prepared to conduct a phone screen with a set of questions, again, that you've created prior to the call, and what you're going to be asking each applicant. Again, here, consistency is going to be key in interviewing in order to give each applicant the same experience and a fair opportunity to showcase their skills, and for you to really be able to accurately compare those applicants when you're fully through the process. So phone screens are typically short and to the point, and you don't really want to get too into the weeds about specifics of the role or any past behavior of the applicants. You kind of want to keep it around 10 to 15 minutes, helping ensure that the recruiting process is not kind of being bogged down by endless interviews and that it's not a huge time commitment for the applicant. Basically, the questions should be direct enough so you can determine if you want to move forward or not within that time frame, the 10 to 15 minute window. And it's very important to then let the applicant know what the next steps in the process will be, even a general outline of what to expect, who they might be meeting with, the general expectation of when you'll be reaching back out to the applicant either way. So, if I'm doing a screening, I will typically say, I'm holding screens for this week or the next 2 weeks. I'll be in touch with you on this date. And if you don't hear from me from, a certain time, then certainly feel free to reach out to me as well. Just kind of keeping that line of communication open helps with the transparency of the recruiting process and really starts to build a relationship with the applicant. And one thing I didn't mention, I don't think yet, on the screening is that it's a really good time to kind of reiterate any knockout questions you have. So these are going to be any of like the deal breakers, right? So for example, reviewing rate of pay or a pay range expectations, hours of availability, that kind of thing. There's really nothing worse than getting to the end of the interview process and then realizing that your starting pay is completely out of line with the candidate's expectations, or that they can't work, say, the required Saturday shift that you included on the job posting. And then it's kind of like back to the drawing board, even though you went through the whole process. So just keeping that in mind. And then moving to scheduling interviews. So now that you know which applicants you want to speak with more in depth, it's kind of time to determine who's going to be conducting those interviews. You'll want to consider the role and its place in the organization to decide who the applicant will meet with, depending on the role. You'll also want to schedule, well, obviously time with the position manager, but the team they're working with as well. And, depending on the position, it could mean that they meet with other relevant department heads or employees that they're going to, be in regular contact with. So kind of just having an idea and building out that team from the start. While prior to COVID, you might have been able to conduct an interview in an office meeting room, remote work has presented new challenges, obviously. Many of us have moved to virtual meeting platforms like Zoom, Microsoft Teams, or Google Hangouts, at least for a portion of the interview process. And, this can definitely be an alternative, an easy alternative to physically meeting, and it has its benefits as well as far as collaboration, but it's different than what we're kind of used to with on-site interviewing. And so, we always suggest just kind of reviewing any questions about the technology ahead of time, or addressing common user errors in your electronic interview invitation to the candidate. Of course, for any in-person interviews, you also want to be conscious of the location of your interview, making sure that it's accessible to anyone with a disability and that they're going to be able to easily access the interview space. Okay, so on to conducting the interview itself. If you've ever conducted an in-person interview, you already know the importance of choosing the right environment to conduct the interview. It can be a really extremely stressful situation for the candidates. And so creating a comfortable environment is really an easy place to start to minimize stress. You want to make sure the location of the interview is somewhat private, quiet, and away from the rest of the company. It'll really help the applicant focus on what you're asking them and keep them from feeling like they're kind of on display. It's also very easy to disrupt an applicant's train of thought by using verbal gestures. So to show you're paying attention, just all the standard nonverbal cues you want to give, like nodding, smiling, maintaining eye contact, all that good stuff, just showing them that you're really engaged and paying attention. And this can be even more important when it comes to virtual interviews. So you really want to avoid multitasking, and all of your focus should be reserved for the candidate that you're interviewing. And I know, especially even for myself, it's very tempting to check emails, send off a quick note in, Microsoft Teams while a candidate is kind of midstream in explanation, but it can be really obvious if you're not giving the candidate your full attention. And we also, we want to remember that the candidate is interviewing us as well. So putting our best foot forward when it comes to impressing the best talent is important as well. So encouraging candidates to ask questions and bring up concerns or feedback throughout the interview, not just at the end. This can really help with the flow of the interview and making it feel a bit more like a comfortable conversation, even though, you're not really diving into any of those personal questions that we're trying to avoid. And as with the initial phone screen, you should be consistently asking the same questions of each applicant, kind of keeping them informed of the next steps, but without promising anything. So this is a really, really big part of it, which I've had some hiring managers in the past that kind of, they're having a really great interview, they're blown away, they want to hire this person yesterday. And they end up saying something in the interview, like, between you and me, like, you've got it, or something to that effect. And we want to avoid that as much as possible. And we'll see, for many reasons when it comes to compliance and equity, but also just, you never know what's going to show up in someone's background check, or maybe they need a valid driver's license to perform the job, and your insurance company won't allow them to be on your insurance policy. So things that are out of the hiring manager's control, you're just going to want to be aware of those things and not make any promises ahead of time. Okay, so some other tips on virtual interviewing, because it's where a lot of us are spending our time, and how a lot of candidates are preferring to work these days as well. So just like an in-person interview, you should really make sure that you're in a professional environment with no distractions. So this can take some planning and preparation in the world of virtual interviews, but just making sure that your background's appropriate, and distractions, things like dogs or kids in the background, trying to limit that as much as possible. Although I'll say I never knew how much my dog whined until I started holding so many virtual client meetings and presentations. So just being aware of those types of things. And then, even though the interview is being done remotely, making sure that you're still in professional attire, even if you're at home and you have at MP, we have a kind of dress for your day dress code, which is really great. And so if we're meeting with clients, it's more professional. And then if we're not for the afternoon, people might throw on a hoodie, but then remembering that if you have an interview coming up, you want to change into that clothes and interviewing clothes and give the respect that the interview deserves. And then just testing your technology prior to the interview, making sure everything's working properly. You have a strong internet connection can be big. An interview can potentially be derailed by loss of connection, or internet cutting in and out on the applicant, that kind of thing. Lastly, this is a big one. You want to be sure to showcase your company, right? So virtual applicants really miss out on experiencing your company environment and culture like they would in a typical on-site interview when they come in and get a feel for all their potential coworkers and the environment. So you just want to be ready to speak to your company's values, the work-life balance, team dynamics, and more. So some of the other pieces you might want to touch on in virtual interviews are making specific questions, right? So if it's going to be a hybrid role, this new kind of work model, or a fully remote position, it'd be good to kind of ask candidates and gauge where they're at with their previous experience and comfortability with working from home. So asking things like, what aspects of working from home do you enjoy, and which do you find most challenging? Or when you're working remotely, how do you organize your day? And with it just becoming more and more prevalent, it's a good idea to kind of incorporate these into your interviews moving forward. And then the last step we're going to look at is evaluating the interviews. So once you've completed your interviews, it's really important to compare and contrast the responses of each applicant. You're going to ideally set up a ranking system, such as a 1 to 5 of how they responded to the question, and it'll help you narrow your funnel to a limited number of high quality candidates. And then you can further evaluate them for the position from there. So I typically suggest, when I'm building my outline with my team, putting the questions together, we will put a ranking system on each question. That way, at least if you don't have time to take a lot of notes on it, you can circle, it's a terrible answer, you give them a 1, or it's something where you're like, wow, I never thought about it that way, really love the way they reframed that, I'm going to give them a 5. And then you have a general, really quick insight. If you're looking at one applicant, they're mostly 5s, and you're looking at another that's 3s and 4s maybe, then that can kind of help you narrow things down. And it is important that the evaluation of the responses is objective and unbiased, in the same way that you've been conducting all the interviews thus far. And this ensures that every applicant's being treated fairly. All right, so now that we've kind of reviewed the basics of planning, preparing, and conducting the interview, we're going to talk a little bit more about technique. Behavioral interviewing being one of the foremost, it's kind of an essential job interview technique that every team can utilize to make optimal hires. So it's a style of interviewing that was developed in the 1970s by industrial psychologists. And the premise behind behavioral interviewing is that the most accurate predictor of future performance is past performance in a similar situation. So when we're looking at technique in general, just going to do a quick overview of traditional interviewing, so we can see how behavioral interviewing really differs from it. So traditional interviews tend to include hypothetical, cognitive, or personality type questions. Those really like the opener questions, when you're asking somebody, tell me about yourself. Why did you leave your last company? What's your biggest weakness? Where do you see yourself in 5 years? All of those very generic, kind of expected interview questions. And, as you can see, they tend to be more close-ended, which doesn't really encourage candidates to share much more than a simple answer. Though this information can definitely be really valuable to a hiring manager, and is still helpful to ask candidates. You just want to make sure it's not the only type of question you're using for the evaluation. And that is because the behavioral interviewing style is really going to give you a much more comprehensive picture of the candidate's potential. And we'll look at that in just a moment. But when answering behavioral questions, candidates have to provide substantiated proof of their skills and abilities. And in contrast with the traditional interview questions, there are often opportunities for candidates to give you, what they think is the quote unquote right answer. And so an eager candidate, could answer a non-behavioral interview question with something they feel the hiring manager wants to hear rather than the truth. I think we've all, if you've done any amount of hiring or interviewing, you've been in a situation where you're like, you have an off feeling about someone, but they're saying all of the right words to you. So the behavioral technique is a way to dive deeper into why you're getting that feeling from them, and kind of dig into if they're kind of BSing their way through the interview or not. So basically, it's a way to analyze if the candidate's really going to succeed in this role. And so it draws out information and details about past performance. And, as we just went over, the past performance is the strongest indicator of how the candidate will perform in their new role. So you're going to want to focus on questions like, give me an example of a time when you made an error, and then how did you handle that? And you can kind of dig in and ask more probing questions as they get into their answer as well. Or you can kind of put all the questions out there at once, and then you might have to kind of prompt or remind them of the details you were looking for. But so for example, describe a difficult time you've had dealing with an employee, customer, coworker. Why was it difficult? How did you handle it? And what was the outcome, right? So really looking for all of those specifics. It's much harder to fake this kind of thing, or if they are, it's easier to tell. And so but it also allows the top talent and the good candidates to give you concrete examples of how they did behave in the real situation instead of asking how they would have behaved in a hypothetical situation. And again, as I mentioned before, just it's key to use those follow-up or probing questions to dig deeper into the candidate's response. So the next slide here, actually one more, we're going to go to the STAR approach. So this builds on behavioral interviewing and is a technique used to kind of gather the relevant information about a specific capability. So basically it's structured in a way that this is how you're looking for the answer to be given to you from the candidate when you're asking a behavioral based interview question. And that is by the breakdown of the STAR approach, in that it's the situation that they're going to explain, then go through the task, their action, and the result of the situation. So for example, as the interviewer, you would ask, describe a situation when you had to deliver excellent customer service following a complaint. And then on our next slide, we've outlined an example of the STAR approach and what a strong answer would look like in this case. So the situation here, the candidate is saying a customer contacted me complaining that they'd waited more than 2 weeks for a reply regarding a product inquiry, so not great. So the task that I needed to address the client's immediate inquiry and find out what went wrong in the normal process. Their action then being, I apologized, got the details, and passed them to our sales lead, who connected or contacted the client within an hour. I investigated why the inquiry hadn't been answered and discovered that it was a combination of wrong mobile number and a generic email address that wasn't being checked. I let the client know we would offer a goodwill discount on the next order. And then the result being the client not only continued to order from us, but posted a positive customer service review. So as you can see, structuring your questions and asking probing follow-up questions using the STAR model will prompt the candidate to provide concrete examples or proof that they really possess that experience and the skills needed for the job at hand. You'll be looking at the candidate to be able to share examples of how they successfully handled the past situations at work. And if they're unable to do so in detail, that's really a red flag. This technique is a really good way to combat those who may be great at, kind of fibbing their way through the traditional interview process. All right, so on our next slide, we are going to transition into some general best practices surrounding interviewing and selection. One of them being retaining applications and resumes for 1 year. This is something I find is often maybe not done, or just businesses and maybe are not as aware of this requirement, but it is a federal requirement, a minimum retention of these hiring documents for 1 year. And it can be longer as well, depending on, for federal contractors, it can be 2 or 3 years. There can also be additional state or local regulations that you'll want to check depending on what area of the country you're in. And the reason that these are required to be kept on file is it's addressing, hiring records when it comes to any claims of Title VII discrimination, Americans with Disabilities Act, or the Age Discrimination Act. And we're going to dig into these things a little bit more when we get into discrimination and compliance. But just know that's kind of the background on why it's so important that you keep these documents on file. And it's also best practice to conduct any background checks and drug testing after the offer, but before employment begins. So this is a mandated state and local, in many state and local criminal and credit check ordinances. So you want to just, again, check state and local law when it comes to background checks. And this practice can also kind of help mitigate the risk of other unlawful employment practice claims. Next is social media. So we all we're all on social media pretty often, and now many employers are using it as either a sourcing or recruiting platform, and if not, maybe just to kind of check out the potential candidates that they're looking at. And so it can be useful for that, but it can also be used improperly and then trigger discrimination claims. And because you can get information on social media that will reveal a candidate's race, sexual orientation, gender identity, national origin, religion, disability, and any of those other protected statuses that would not really be revealed in a typical application process or resume. So you just have to be really careful of that. And then the last is reference checks to avoid any claims of negligent hiring. So under the doctrine of negligent hiring, an employer is liable for the harm its employees inflict on any third parties when the employer knew or should have known that there was a potential risk there, and that could have been uncovered by reasonable investigation. So conducting reference checks is always a good idea. Next, we have a couple of topics to kind of review based on interviews amid COVID, right? It's brought up a lot of new challenges. And as the pandemic is kind of ongoing, things are always constantly changing. It's presented some really unique challenges in the workplace, and hiring is no exception. So in 2022 and beyond, many employers will need to strategize about how to discuss vaccination status with job applicants. And as public health discussions and all the requirements change, employers may decide to make receiving COVID-19 vaccine a condition of employment. However, there is definitely a right way to go about this, and it can mitigate significant risk. So digging into some of the specific interview questions, some of the most common ones that come up for us are, can I ask if the candidate is vaccinated against COVID-19? So the answer is technically yes, but we do advise as a best practice that you do not ask about vaccination status until after making the job offer, what we see a lot of as best practice is putting it right in your job posting, right? So if you are a company that has determined that for your workforce, it is a business necessity that your staff be vaccinated, and you're moving forward with that, that's totally fine as long as you're allowing for those religious or medical accommodations. But you want to just put that out there right from the beginning that, requirements of the job must be vaccinated. And, by if you have a certain date or to work on site, if the job is not remote at all, that kind of thing. And then again, you can just reiterate it in the interview saying, oh, I do have to let every candidate know that being fully vaccinated is a requirement of this position. And then just leave it at that. You don't necessarily have to get, any answer from them at this point. You can gather at the time of hire, the documentation you might need about vaccination, or have them go through the reasonable accommodation process if that is necessary. And the reason that we recommend that as best practice is because if you do flat out ask if someone is vaccinated, and which you can do, the EEOC, so the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, they have recently clarified that asking the employee solely their vaccination status is not a disability related inquiry. But what happens is it can get kind of a slippery slope and get into murky areas really quickly. And so basically what you want to avoid is anything regarding the asking a potential employee or candidate about a disability, right? So under the Americans with Disabilities Act, it's really not something that you can ask about and it's protected information under the ADA. So if you ask a candidate if they're vaccinated and they go on like a long tangent that wasn't asked for, but maybe they just say no, and here's why. I have all these medical conditions, and this is why my doctor has told me not to be vaccinated, or whatever it might be, then you are all of a sudden privy to all of that medical information that you do not want in the interviewing or hiring portion of the process. So that's why we try to avoid that. And then can I choose to hire someone who refuses to work on site? Employers may require employees to work from home, and they may decline to hire applicants who refuse to work on location if that's necessary for the job. So, it's definitely possible. That said, we just always like to caution employers that you should kind of make these decisions on a case-by-case basis while keeping an eye on consistency, right? So the reason for the refusal may be important. While employers are not required to accommodate like a generalized anxiety about contracting COVID, they should apply the same ADA reasonable accommodation analysis where candidates have disclosed an underlying health condition that may place them at a higher risk. And some positions cannot be accommodated, but it's important for employers to show how they reach the conclusion and that they are really going through the process with each position. Okay, so diving into some prohibited and sensitive interview topics. Every HR professional or hiring manager should really prioritize compliance throughout the recruiting and interview process. So, businesses that ask illegal questions, they really increase their risk and exposure. Additionally, non-compliant interview questions could really make the candidates consider dropping out of the hiring process. Candidates may view sensitive or non-compliant questions as an indication of a toxic work environment. And this is particularly damaging to employers today when candidates prioritize company culture and also in the candidate market have more choice than they have in quite some time. So topics you want to avoid are going to be anything around religion, pregnancy and family planning, marital status, gender, salary, health and disability, race, ethnicity, or nationality, criminal records, or debt. And while this is by no means a comprehensive list, they're all topics that you should really avoid or eliminate from the interview process. And so under discrimination considerations, there are many federal and state laws, and they're just growing, which are in place to reduce discrimination in hiring and employment. And so this is a big part of why you're wanting to avoid those topics on the previous screen, right? So in all 50 states, federal law makes it illegal to discriminate on race, color, national origin, religion, sex, including pregnancy, childbirth, and other related conditions, disability, age when you are 40 years old or older. And there's definitely other things that fall into that category as well. And so these can fall into different provisions under things like Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, Age Discrimination in Employment Act, Pregnancy Discrimination Act, and Americans with Disabilities Act. And again, those are all federal, and there's more than that, but this is just kind of a starting point. You could definitely do a whole presentation just on these different protections and discrimination considerations and unconscious bias and all of those things, but we're just kind of giving you a quick overview today. So in addition to the federal laws, you'll also notice that more and more states have additional laws which prohibit discrimination. And, for example, some of the more common and recent ones would be arrest records and pay equity, or criminal history and pay equity. So many states have laws that prohibit discrimination based on both of those things. And for example, I'm here in Massachusetts, and we have banned the box. It was one of the first states to put this in place, and that was in 2010. And this law really prohibits employers from asking job candidates about their criminal histories on an initial written application. And so this is, let's see, currently nationwide in 37 states and 150 cities have chosen to adopt this. So definitely something that should be on your radar, and you want to check if you're in an area where this will apply to you. And it's really put into place to, you know, allow people to have a second chance who have been incarcerated, and give them a chance to get to that interview and really get employment, gainful employment. And then the Equal Pay Acts as well are popping up more and more. Massachusetts was kind of at the forefront with that as well. And they basically ban employers from asking prospective workers what they made at their last job. And the goal in this one is to really prevent women or people of color from being stuck in a cycle of lower salaries. And pay equity laws, they kind of boomed in 2016, and they're still changing, but places like California, New York, as I mentioned, Massachusetts were some of the first ones to adopt, and other states are following suit, enacting salary history bans and pay scale disclosures. So for example, New York just passed a regulation in which it is going to be required that they put the pay scale on the job posting itself. And then Rhode Island just overhauled their equal pay law as well. And so there's new provisions to that starting effective in 2023. So while we could talk about the specifics of those legal implications all day, we are kind of going to set aside the rest of the time to go over questions. And I'm quickly going to just cover a couple of illegal or inappropriate interview questions before we get into all of your questions. I see there's a few in the Q&A chat, which is great. But so just to give you an idea, we'll start up with some examples around like familial responsibilities, children, marriage. You definitely want to avoid any of these questions. Are you married? Do you have kids? What's your child care arrangements? And so, you know, you may, with the childcare arrangements, maybe getting at, is it going to interfere with your work at all? But we really need to frame it and ask it in a different way, as it's not an appropriate way to ask the question. And it needs to be framed around the job itself. And it's not often that these questions are asked to men, right? So questions about marital status, ages, or numbers of children are frequently used to discriminate against women, and may violate Title VII if they're used to deny or limit employment opportunities. And then another one that comes up that I think sometimes stumps people, or they're not really sure why it can lead to increased risk or exposure, are things like, what type of transportation do you use, or do you have a car, right? What they're really asking is, can you get to work on time and be here every day? But the reason that we don't want to frame it around the, having the vehicle itself is because the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or EEOC, considers car ownership financial information. So, while federal law doesn't prevent employers from asking candidates about financial information, the federal equal employment opportunity laws prohibit employers from illegally discriminating when it comes to using financial information to make employment decisions. So basically, the EEOC ruled that this could significantly disadvantage people of a particular race, color, national origin, sex, etc. It's really doesn't matter to the company, right? If you have your own vehicle to get to work, or if you use public transportation, you bike, you carpool, that all of that should really have no bearing on how you're going to be able to perform, or the candidate will be able to perform the job itself. So that's kind of the framework. And a lot of the questions can be just like we went over, like very vague and gray areas. So let's take a minute and get into any of the questions that you all had. Okay. A source for good behavioral interviewing questions. Yes, we have some templated guides that we can share, and let's see if we can send over some resources for you as well. I know that Katie will be sending over a copy of the slide deck at the end of the presentation, so we can definitely add some resources in there for you as well. Okay, this is a great question here. We mentioned not talking about salary in the interview. I found that the candidate brings up the salary a lot. How do we avoid that topic? And I may have talked about this a little bit in reframing questions. And that's often what we're going to be doing when it's finding kind of nuanced ways to frame the questions in new ways that are taking out the potentially discriminatory aspect of it, right? So you can certainly still ask, at least in many states, and again, this is kind of progressing and changing regularly. So you can ask them, what are your salary expectations, right? So you can still ask them what they would like to make for the job. But you cannot require them to tell you what their past salary was. However, that being said, many candidates will offer that up. So if you ask what their salary expectations are, they might say, oh, well, in my last position, I was making, $20 an hour or whatever it is, and I would like to be at that or above. So in that case, like, you as the company, you're still within compliance to ask them what they'd like to make. And it was the candidate's choice to disclose that information. But if you were to flat out ask them, what did you make at your last job? The candidate could then come back and say, that's an illegal question. You can't ask me that. And again, the idea is just because, people who have been marginalized or stuck in kind of low income or low earning positions, it's a way to keep them from continually being in that cycle. So that was a great question. Let's see if we have any others here. Yeah, absolutely. You're welcome for your answer. And some of them are a little bit longer, so we might have to follow up on our offline, on our follow-up email to you all. So I'm going to turn it back over to Katie to wrap it up, and we'll be in touch with any additional outline questions and the slides and all of that.
Thank you, Sarah. Lots of valuable information on a complex topic. Any questions that were not able to be answered on today's program will receive a response via email. The NPHR team is here to help guide your organization on any HR compliance issues. If you'd like to learn more about how we can assist your organization, please visit our website to set up a short 15-minute call. Be sure to join us next week on the same day and time for our webinar on unpacking the employee retention credit, funding for businesses impacted by COVID. Visit our website to register and see the full calendar of upcoming events and available resources. We will be sending out a recording of today's webinar with the presentation slides this afternoon. Thanks for joining us and have a terrific day.